Gary Coleman was the highest paid child actor in television history. At 10 years old, he was earning $70,000 per episode, had a net worth of $18 million, and was one of the most recognizable faces in America. His catchphrase was repeated in playgrounds across the country. His face was on lunchboxes and posters, and he was pulling in ratings that made NBC executives weep with joy. 30 years later, he was working as a shopping mall security guard for minimum wage, living in a trailer, battling his own parents in court over stolen money, and dealing with health problems that would eventually kill him at age 42. Today we're going to discover how Gary Coleman went from being television's golden child to dying broke, bitter, and broken. Welcome to Celebrities Done. Gary Wayne Coleman was born on February 8, 1968, in Zion, Illinois. From the very beginning, life dealt him a brutal hand. He was born with a congenital kidney disease that would plague him for his entire life and require 2 kidney transplants before he turned 14. The disease also stunted his growth, meaning Gary would never grow taller than 4 feet 8 inches. The medication he took to manage his condition caused facial swelling and other physical changes that made him look perpetually childlike even as he aged. Most kids with these health challenges would have had difficult, limited lives. But Gary's parents, Willie and Sue Coleman, saw opportunity. Willie and Sue weren't wealthy people. Willie worked as a pharmaceutical technician and Sue was a nurse. When they adopted Gary as an infant, they had no idea he would become their lottery ticket. But as Gary got older, they noticed something special about him. Despite his health problems and small stature, he had incredible charisma. He was funny, expressive, and had perfect comedic timing. He could deliver lines that made adults laugh until they cried. And most importantly, for what was about to happen, he looked adorable on camera. Gary started doing commercials when he was 5 years old. He appeared in ads for Harris Bank in Chicago, and casting directors immediately recognized his talent. Here was a kid who could take direction, hit marks, remember lines, and most crucially, make audiences fall in love with him instantly. By age 8, Gary was getting called in for television auditions in Los Angeles. His parents moved the family to California, betting everything on Gary's potential career. And in 1978, that bet paid off spectacularly. Norman Lear, the legendary television producer behind shows like All in the Family and The Jeffersons, was developing a new sitcom called Diff'rent Strokes. The show's premise was about a wealthy white businessman who adopts 2 black boys from Harlem after their mother, his housekeeper, dies. It was a high-concept comedy that dealt with race, class, and family in ways that were progressive for the late 70s. But the show needed the perfect kid to play Arnold Jackson, the younger of the 2 brothers. The character had to be cute enough to be lovable, funny enough to carry comedic scenes, and talented enough to handle serious, dramatic moments when the show tackled important issues. Gary Coleman auditioned and blew everyone away. At 10 years old, he had the timing of a veteran comedian and the presence of a born entertainer. Norman Lear cast him immediately, and Diff'rent Strokes premiered on November 3, 1978 on NBC. The show was an instant hit. Critics loved it, audiences loved it, and everyone loved Gary Coleman. His character Arnold became the breakout star, delivering catchphrases that became part of American culture. The most famous, delivered with perfect incredulity and sass, became one of the most quoted lines in television history. The ratings were massive. Diff'rent Strokes regularly pulled in 20 to 30 million viewers per episode in its first few seasons. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of a Super Bowl-level audience watching your show every single week. Gary Coleman was 10 years old and was the star of one of the biggest shows on television. NBC knew they had struck gold, and they paid accordingly. By the end of the first season, Gary was earning $70,000 per episode. Adjusted for inflation, that's approximately $300,000 per episode in today's money. For a 10-year-old kid. Over the course of Diff'rent Strokes' 8-season run from 1978 to 1986, Gary earned approximately $18 million. $18 million. He was the highest paid child actor in television history at that point. The money was flowing in so fast that Gary's parents set up a trust fund and a corporation to manage his earnings. California law required that a percentage of child actor earnings be set aside in a protected trust, but there were loopholes and ways around the protections if parents were unscrupulous enough. And Willie and Sue Coleman, as it would later be revealed, were exactly that unscrupulous. But before we get to the financial devastation, let's talk about what Gary's life was like during his peak fame years. He was a superstar. He couldn't go anywhere without being mobbed by fans. He appeared on magazine covers, talk shows, and award ceremonies. He was invited to the White House. He had his own merchandise line with dolls, posters, and clothing bearing his face and catchphrases. Other celebrities wanted to meet him. Michael Jackson was reportedly a fan and invited Gary to his ranch. Gary was living a life that most kids couldn't even dream of, and it was destroying him. The pressure on child actors is immense under the best circumstances. But Gary had additional burdens that made his situation even worse. He was working 12 to 14-hour days on set, memorizing pages of dialogue, hitting marks, taking direction from adults who sometimes treated him more like a prop than a person. He didn't have a normal childhood. He didn't go to regular school or have regular friends. He was tutored on set for 3 hours a day, as required by law, but the rest of his time was spent working. He never got to play Little League, go to birthday parties, or experience the simple joys of being a kid. His entire existence was about making other people money, and his health was always precarious. Gary's kidney disease required constant medical management. He took medications that had serious side effects. He had frequent doctor's appointments and hospital stays. In 1973, when he was 5 years old, he had his first kidney transplant. The surgery was successful, but required intense recovery and ongoing immunosuppressant drugs to prevent his body from rejecting the new kidney. Then in 1984, at age 16, his transplanted kidney failed and he needed a second transplant. This meant more surgery, more recovery, more medications, and more physical limitations, all while trying to maintain a career as a television star. The medications Gary took, particularly the steroids used to prevent organ rejection, had visible effects. They caused his face to swell and puff up, giving him a round, childlike appearance that persisted well into adulthood. While this helped him continue playing young characters even as he got older, it also meant he was dealing with constant physical discomfort and self-consciousness about his appearance. Imagine being a teenager and looking in the mirror to see a face that doesn't match your age because of the drugs keeping you alive. The psychological toll was enormous. But here comes the part that transforms Gary's story from sad to absolutely enraging. While Gary was working himself to exhaustion and dealing with life-threatening health problems, his parents were systematically stealing his money. Willie and Sue Coleman had control over Gary's finances through a corporation they had set up called Gary Coleman Productions. The structure was supposed to protect Gary's earnings and ensure he would have financial security for life. Instead, his parents used it as their personal piggy bank. According to later court documents and testimony, Willie and Sue were spending Gary's money on themselves with shocking abandon. They bought themselves houses, cars, vacations, and luxury goods. They put family members on Gary's payroll for jobs they didn't actually do. They made questionable business investments using Gary's money without his knowledge or consent. They lived like millionaires because their son was a millionaire, but they were spending his money, not theirs. And Gary, who was just a kid working brutal hours to earn that money, had no idea what was happening. California's Coogan Law, named after child actor Jackie Coogan, who was similarly exploited by his parents in the 1920s, was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of theft. The law required that 15% of a child actor's earnings be set aside in a blocked trust account that parents couldn't touch. But the law had weaknesses, and the Colemans exploited every single one of them. The remaining 85% of Gary's earnings were theoretically protected by contracts and corporate structures, but in practice, his parents had access to most of it and spent it freely. Diff'rent Strokes ended in 1986 after 8 seasons. Gary was 18 years old, legally an adult, and ready to take control of his finances and his life. That's when he discovered the devastating truth. Most of his $18 million was gone. His parents had spent or mismanaged the vast majority of his earnings. The trust that should have contained millions had been systematically drained. Gary was 18 years old, had worked since he was 5, had earned one of the largest fortunes in child actor history, and was essentially broke. The betrayal was crushing. These weren't strangers or crooked business managers. These were his parents, the people who were supposed to protect him and look out for his best interests. Instead, they had treated him like an ATM machine, extracting money for their own benefit while he worked himself sick earning it. Gary sued his parents and his former advisors in 1989, seeking to recover his lost earnings. The case dragged through courts for years, revealing ugly details about financial mismanagement and family dysfunction. In 1993, after 4 years of litigation, Gary won a settlement of $1.3 million. $1.3 million out of $18 million earned. That's less than 10% recovery. The rest was gone, spent by his parents, consumed by legal fees, or lost to bad investments and mismanagement. The court case destroyed whatever remained of Gary's relationship with Willie and Sue. He never spoke to them again after the settlement. Years later, when his mother died, Gary didn't attend her funeral. When his father died, Gary publicly stated he felt nothing. The betrayal had killed any love he had for his parents. But the financial devastation was only part of Gary's problems. His career had also collapsed. After Diff'rent Strokes ended, Gary struggled to find work. This is a common problem for child actors, especially those who are huge stars. The public has a fixed image of them as children, and it's nearly impossible to transition to adult roles. Gary's physical appearance made this problem even worse. He was 4 feet 8 inches tall with a round, youthful face. He didn't look like a teenager or young adult. He looked like a kid, which meant he was stuck competing for child roles even though he was in his 20s. The few acting jobs he could get were humiliating come-downs from his Diff'rent Strokes glory. He appeared in low-budget made-for-TV movies. He did guest spots on struggling sitcoms. He took voiceover work for animated shows. None of it paid well or generated the kind of attention his earlier work had received. Hollywood had moved on, and Gary Coleman was yesterday's news. The industry that had made him rich and famous as a child had no use for him as an adult. The typecasting was brutal and inescapable. Whenever Gary auditioned for serious dramatic roles or action parts, casting directors would see Arnold Jackson from Diff'rent Strokes. They couldn't separate the actor from the character. And even when directors wanted to take a chance on him, producers and studio executives would veto the casting because they didn't think audiences would accept Gary Coleman as anything other than the cute kid from that old sitcom. He was trapped in amber, permanently frozen as his 10-year-old self in the public consciousness. By the mid-90s, Gary's career had essentially ended. He was in his late 20s and couldn't get meaningful acting work. The money from his lawsuit settlement was running out. His medical expenses were constant and expensive. He was taking over a dozen medications daily to manage his kidney disease and prevent organ rejection. The drugs alone cost thousands of dollars per month. He had no steady income, diminishing savings, and mounting bills. For the first time in his life, Gary Coleman was facing real poverty. In 1998, something happened that perfectly encapsulates how far Gary had fallen. He took a job as a security guard at a shopping mall in Los Angeles. Let that sink in for a moment. The highest paid child actor in television history, the star of one of the most successful sitcoms of the 80s, was working mall security for minimum wage. He wore a uniform, walked around checking that doors were locked, and dealt with shoplifters and rowdy teenagers. Shoppers would recognize him and either feel sorry for him or mock him. Both reactions were equally humiliating. The media had a field day with this development. Tabloids ran stories with headlines like "Diff'rent Strokes for Gary Coleman" and "From Riches to Rags." Late-night comedians made jokes about him. The internet, which was just becoming mainstream, turned him into a meme before memes were really a thing. Gary Coleman working as a mall cop became shorthand for child star failure and wasted talent. Every article about the dangers of child stardom would reference him. He had become a cautionary tale, and the worst part was that he was still alive to see it. But the humiliation of the mall security job wasn't the lowest point. That was still to come. In 1999, Gary was shopping at a store in Los Angeles when he was approached by a woman asking for an autograph. According to witnesses and police reports, the woman became aggressive and started making insulting comments about his height and his career. Gary, who had endured decades of this kind of treatment, snapped. He punched the woman in the face. The assault was witnessed by multiple people. The woman pressed charges, and Gary was arrested. The legal consequences were relatively minor. Gary pleaded no contest to assault and was sentenced to probation and anger management classes. But the reputational damage was severe. The incident confirmed the narrative that many people already believed, that Gary Coleman was bitter, angry, and couldn't handle the pressure of his failed career. Talk shows and entertainment news programs discussed his meltdown. Psychiatrists who had never met him went on television to speculate about his mental health. The public, which had loved him as a child, now viewed him as a tragic figure at best, and a violent has-been at worst. Throughout the 2000s, Gary's life continued to spiral. He had brief, tumultuous relationships. In 2007, at age 39, he married Shannon Price, a woman he had met on the set of a low-budget film. The marriage was a disaster from the start. According to friends and later court testimony, Shannon was verbally and possibly physically abusive. The couple appeared on the reality show Divorce Court in 2008, where they aired their grievances on national television for a small paycheck. The episode showed a relationship characterized by screaming matches, mutual resentment, and dysfunction. They divorced in 2008 after less than a year of marriage, but continued living together on and off, which would prove to be a fatal decision. Gary's financial situation never improved. Despite occasional acting work and appearance fees, he was essentially living in poverty. Various reports from this period describe him living in a trailer home, driving a beat-up car, and struggling to pay for his medications. His kidney disease was getting worse as he aged, and the constant medical interventions were taking a physical toll. He looked older than his years, worn down by health problems, financial stress, and the psychological damage of his traumatic life story. In 2003, Gary did something that seemed desperate and sad. He ran for governor of California during the recall election that eventually put Arnold Schwarzenegger in office. Gary's campaign was never serious. He had no political experience, no real platform, and no chance of winning. He was one of 135 candidates on the ballot, and he finished 8th with just over 14,000 votes out of millions cast. The campaign seemed like a publicity stunt designed to get attention and maybe generate some income from appearances and interviews. It worked in terms of attention, but it also reinforced the image of Gary as a former star grasping at relevance. What people didn't fully understand at the time was how sick Gary was. His second transplanted kidney was failing. He was experiencing chronic pain, fatigue, and complications from his various medications. He was essentially dying slowly, watching his body break down piece by piece while struggling to afford the medical care that might extend his life. Friends from this period have said that Gary was in constant discomfort and increasingly depressed about his situation. He felt like he had been cheated by everyone: his parents, the entertainment industry, the legal system, and fate itself. On May 26, 2010, Gary Coleman fell and hit his head at his home in Santaquin, Utah. He had been living there with Shannon Price, his ex-wife, in an on-again, off-again relationship that friends described as toxic. According to the official account, Gary fell downstairs and suffered a traumatic brain injury. Shannon called 911, and Gary was rushed to Utah Valley Regional Medical Center in critical condition. He had an epidural hematoma, which is bleeding between the skull and the brain. The injury was severe, and doctors determined that Gary had minimal brain activity. What happened next became the subject of intense controversy and speculation. Shannon Price, despite being divorced from Gary, made the decision to take him off life support. On May 28, 2010, just 2 days after his fall, Gary Coleman died. He was 42 years old. The speed of the decision raised immediate questions. Why was Shannon, his ex-wife, making medical decisions? Where was Gary's family? Why wasn't more time given for possible recovery? The circumstances were suspicious enough that police launched an investigation. The investigation revealed disturbing details. Gary had named Shannon as his healthcare proxy despite their divorce, giving her the legal authority to make medical decisions on his behalf. But friends and former colleagues questioned whether Gary had understood what he was signing or whether Shannon had manipulated him into giving her that power. There were also questions about the fall itself. Some people close to Gary suggested that Shannon might have been involved in causing his injury, though no evidence was ever found to support criminal charges. The investigation concluded that Gary's death was accidental, but doubts lingered. Even in death, Gary Coleman couldn't escape exploitation and controversy. Within hours of his passing, photographs of him on his deathbed were leaked to the press and published by tabloids. The images showed Gary unconscious and intubated, a final violation of his dignity. Shannon Price was widely suspected of selling the photos for money, though she denied it. The publication of those images was condemned by fans and fellow actors as ghoulish and disrespectful, but the damage was done. Gary couldn't even die in peace. The fight over Gary's estate became another ugly chapter. Shannon Price claimed she was entitled to his assets as his common-law wife, despite their divorce. Gary's ex-girlfriend, Anna Gray, produced a will dated 2005 that named her as the primary beneficiary. Gary's former business associate, Dion Mial, produced a different will dated 2007 that named him as executor. 3 different parties all claimed to be Gary's rightful heir, and the estate, valued at only $75,000 at the time of his death, became the subject of years of litigation. Think about that number for a moment. Gary Coleman earned $18 million during his career. He was one of the biggest child stars in television history. And when he died, his entire estate was worth $75,000. That's a 99.6% loss of wealth. After legal fees and debts were paid, there was essentially nothing left. The money had been stolen by his parents, consumed by medical expenses, lost to failed career ventures, and eroded by decades of financial struggle. Gary died almost as poor as he had been born. The autopsy revealed the full extent of Gary's physical deterioration. Beyond the brain injury that killed him, his body showed the effects of decades of kidney disease and immunosuppressant drugs. His organs were damaged, his bones were weakened, and his overall physical condition was described by the medical examiner as that of someone much older than 42. Gary's body had been failing for years, and the fall had simply accelerated the inevitable. Even if he had survived the injury, doctors said his quality of life would have been severely compromised. Gary Coleman's funeral was small and private, with only a handful of people attending. Todd Bridges, his co-star from Diff'rent Strokes, was one of the few people from Gary's professional past who showed up to pay respects. Bridges later said that he felt enormous guilt for not staying closer to Gary in his final years, for not doing more to help him through his struggles. But he also acknowledged that Gary was difficult to help, that years of betrayal and exploitation had made him suspicious and isolated. Gary had pushed away most people who tried to be there for him, unable to trust that anyone cared about him, rather than what he represented or what they could get from him. The media coverage of Gary's death was extensive, but not particularly sympathetic. Most articles focused on the tragedy of his wasted potential and the cautionary tale aspects of his story. There were obligatory mentions of his talent and his impact on television, but the overwhelming narrative was about failure and exploitation. Gary Coleman became, in death, what he had been in life, a symbol of everything that can go wrong when a child becomes a commodity. The legal battle over Gary's estate dragged on for years after his death. In 2012, a judge ruled that the 2005 will naming Anna Gray as beneficiary was valid. But by that point, there was essentially nothing left to inherit. Legal fees had consumed most of the estate's value. Shannon Price got nothing. The various creditors who had claims against Gary's estate got pennies on the dollar. In the end, the only people who profited from Gary Coleman's death were the lawyers. Todd Bridges, Gary's former co-star, has spoken extensively about Gary's life in the years since his death. Bridges himself struggled with addiction and legal troubles after Diff'rent Strokes ended, but he managed to recover and rebuild his life. He has said repeatedly that Gary's story is the saddest he knows because Gary never got a chance to recover. The combination of his health problems, financial exploitation, and inability to transition to adult acting created a perfect storm that Gary couldn't escape. Bridges has also criticized the entertainment industry for failing to protect child actors and for discarding them once their utility expires. The other child actors from Diff'rent Strokes had tragic stories too, which reinforces how toxic that show's environment was. Dana Plato, who played Kimberly Drummond, struggled with drug addiction after the show ended and died of an overdose in 1999 at age 34. She had been arrested for armed robbery in 1991 and had appeared in adult films to make money. Her life trajectory was remarkably similar to Gary's. Child stardom, financial problems, exploitation, inability to find work, and early death. The show that made them famous had cursed them. The question everyone asks about Gary Coleman is, could this have been prevented? And the answer is complicated, but mostly yes. If California's child actor protection laws had been stronger and better enforced, Gary's parents wouldn't have been able to steal most of his money. If the entertainment industry had better support systems for transitioning child actors to adult careers, Gary might have found sustainable work. If there had been better medical and psychological support, Gary might have coped better with his health problems and the trauma of his childhood. The failures were systemic, not just personal. But Gary also made choices that made his situation worse. He was, by all accounts, difficult to work with as an adult, often angry and resentful in ways that alienated potential employers and friends. He chose to stay in a toxic relationship with Shannon Price even after their divorce. He spent money unwisely during periods when he did have income. He rejected help from people who genuinely tried to assist him. While these choices were understandable given his trauma and circumstances, they still contributed to his downward spiral. Gary was both a victim and, to some extent, an agent of his own destruction. The legacy of Gary Coleman is primarily as a cautionary tale. When people discuss the dangers of child stardom, Gary's name comes up alongside Judy Garland, Corey Feldman, and other exploited young performers. When legislators propose stronger protections for child actors, they reference Gary's stolen fortune. When parents consider putting their children in entertainment, the wise ones think about what happened to Gary Coleman and reconsider. His suffering has served as a warning, which is a sad kind of legacy, but better than being forgotten entirely. In recent years, there have been some attempts to reassess Gary's legacy and focus more on his talent and less on his tragedy. Diff'rent Strokes remains a culturally significant show that dealt with important social issues, and Gary's performance was genuinely excellent. He had impeccable comic timing, could deliver dramatic moments with real emotion, and brought a naturalistic style to television acting that was ahead of its time. If his career had been managed properly and his health had been better, he might have become a respected character actor or comedian. The talent was there, the opportunity was there, but the exploitation and bad luck destroyed any chance of that happening. Today, if you mention Gary Coleman to someone under 30, they might not even know who he is. His fame has faded with the generation that watched Diff'rent Strokes in real time. But for those who remember, his story remains one of the most heartbreaking in entertainment history. A kid who had everything and ended up with nothing. A talented performer who was chewed up by an industry that values youth and discards people when they're no longer profitable. A sick man who worked himself to exhaustion to make millions for other people and died almost penniless. Gary Coleman's net worth at death was $75,000. His peak net worth was $18 million. That's a loss of $17.9 million, or 99.6% of his wealth. But the financial numbers don't capture the full tragedy. Gary lost his childhood to work. He lost his health to kidney disease and endless medical interventions. He lost his family to their greed and betrayal. He lost his career to typecasting and Hollywood's cruelty. He lost his dignity to tabloids and public mockery. And he lost his life at 42, decades before he should have. Broken in body and spirit. If there's any lesson to take from Gary Coleman's life and death, it's this: fame and money don't protect you from exploitation, especially when you're a child. The entertainment industry will use you up and throw you away without a second thought. Parents who see their children as meal tickets will destroy those children's futures for their own benefit. And society will watch it all happen, be entertained by the spectacle, and then move on to the next tragedy without learning anything or changing anything. Gary Coleman deserved better. He deserved parents who protected him instead of robbing him. He deserved an industry that valued him as a person instead of a commodity. He deserved a legal system that actually safeguarded his earnings. He deserved healthcare that didn't bankrupt him. He deserved a chance at a normal life and a fair shot at happiness. Instead, he got exploitation, betrayal, poverty, and an early death. That's his story, and it's one of the saddest in American entertainment history. What do you think? Should child acting be more heavily regulated, or even banned given how often it destroys young performers? Were Gary's parents prosecuted enough for what they did, or should they have faced criminal charges? And does the entertainment industry have any responsibility for what happened to Gary Coleman, or is this just a tragic individual case? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more stories of child stars who were exploited and destroyed by fame, hit that subscribe button and let us know who we should cover next. Should we dive into Corey Feldman's allegations about Hollywood pedophilia? Judy Garland's addiction and exploitation by MGM? Or maybe the tragic story of Dana Plato? This has been Celebrities Done. Thanks for watching, and remember, the cost of fame is sometimes everything you have, including your life.